Hello, I'm Tara Kate. I'm a bird artist and illustrator, and this is the Bird Artist Cottage. If you're new here, please take a moment to hit that like and subscribe, and if you're a returning viewer, thank you so much. As you may remember, I am illustrating a book on birds of Oregon, but I also do art for recreation and pleasure, and also to grow and learn as an artist, even while I'm doing a really big work project. And one of the things that's really important to me and which helps keep me going is to have a lot of sources of inspiration. And so that's what I'll be exploring with you today in this video. I'll be sharing with you a story of a very special swan who visited us last year and who has come back, and there's more to her story, and I'll be sharing that with you, as well as my collection of art books. I say I'm sharing my collection. I'm sharing part of my collection of art books. My collection of art books is actually very extensive, but I'm sharing a few sources of inspiration with you that have been very important to me lately. I don't remember if I've mentioned this before or not, but I just finished filming a Skillshare class. It's going to be called Drawing Birds for Beginners. All of the videos recorded, and I'm now working on editing. If you'd like to keep up on the launch of that class, then I invite you to join my online community. It's free, and you get goodies and updates from me, as well as behind the scenes photos and inspiration that I don't share anywhere else. You can find the link for that community in the description below. So here is the next segment, and I'll see you at the end of the video. The first book I want to share with you is Manual of Ornithology, Avian Structure and Function by Noble Proctor and Patrick Lynch. Douglas gave this book to me many years ago, and it very much inspired me then to want to become an artist, and still inspires me now. The first illustration I want to share with you is this one. As you can see, Patrick illustrated this book in ink, and I think this illustration is absolutely exquisite. And I love it for so many reasons, not the least of which is that I have actually seen all of these birds, attending an army ant swarm just as they're depicted in the illustration. I know all of these species personally. And so, yeah, there's a lot of emotion around this illustration. This inspired me so much as a young woman, as a graduate student who longed to be an artist, and now as a professional bird artist, I look at this with so much admiration, and it inspires me still. So much of what I know about birds I learned from this book, whether it be things like the structure of the wing, what the wing feathers are called, how many feathers there are typically on a wing. I learned so much about what to look for in photographs from studying the illustrations in this book. And of course, as a graduate student, I learned everything I needed to know about birds as a professional biologist in terms of like structure, function, anatomy. All of these things I learned from studying this book, and it is still an invaluable resource. Here you see the illustrations of the feet, and these are the kinds of illustrations that I still make reference to in my daily work. If I'm illustrating a bird that I'm not so familiar with, to be able to look then and see what are the numbers of the toes, what are the arrangements of the toes, because they differ from bird family to bird family. And it's extremely important to me to be able to then look at what the placement is, and then I know what to look for on the photo reference. And if the photo reference is not good for a foot, and frequently photo reference for bird photography is less than optimal, this really helps me to know how I should compensate for lack of photo reference and what I should try to get on the illustration and to make it come out correct. So I still use these illustrations in my daily work. I mean, look at this horned grebe. I mean, isn't that just absolutely gorgeous? It's such a beautiful illustration. I really love this book, and I still use it all the time. I'm not sure that this book is still in print, but you may be able to find used copies. The next book I want to share with you is Island Africa by Jonathan Kingdon. And this book is one that is now providing a lot of inspiration and influence for my current project of illustrating this book of the birds of Oregon. This book has such exquisite illustrations and in all kinds of media, from pencil to these beautifully drawn. These were probably painted in gouache. This is done in pencil. You can see that he has put together beautifully done illustrations along with maps and other aspects of the biology of the region. And I'm finding this so helpful because it's helping me to really place in context the way the illustrations that I'm currently creating might be used. I know there are going to be lots of maps in the book that I am illustrating, and that I'm also going to be called on to illustrate things about habitats. And so to see how Jonathan Kingdon did all that in this book has been incredibly helpful to me. And such beautiful, beautiful work. The quality of his illustrations are so beautiful and just absolutely lovely. Aren't these wonderful? But also very loose and artistic. I really admire how this book does not just present birds in a very static way or animals in a very static way, that he's showing them in ways that are incredibly artistic, expressive, loose, wonderful. Oh my gosh, these frogs. Doesn't that just make you that makes my heart go pitter-pat. These illustrations are just exquisite. I just love that. You can tell by the emotion in my voice how much this book means to me. It's just beautiful. I really love this book. This is another one that I'm pretty sure is out of print, but I know that there are used copies available. The next book I want to share with you is Color and Light, A Guide for the Realistic Painter by James Gurney. Lots of people have this book and reference this book, and I've seen it on lots of art book tours, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this book, but I did want to reference it because, wow, I have just learned so much from this book, and I continue to learn from James, not just through this book, but also from his YouTube channel, and I'll link to his YouTube channel in the description below so that you can reference his wonderful tutorials and demonstrations that he records very frequently. James is such a generous teacher. I don't know why I'm so teary today. James is such a generous teacher, and his work is so beautiful, and I continue to learn so much from him, and I'm so grateful for his breadth of knowledge and how he shares that with us. Wonderful book. Another one that is available used, widely available. Highly, highly recommended. The next book I want to share with you is Drawn, The Art of Ascent by Jeremy Collins. This is a book you may not be familiar with. And you may not know that I aspire to do sequential art, not maybe necessarily graphic novels or children's books, but some kind of sequential art. This book is wonderful in that it is Jeremy's journey through time and how he illustrated this journey and how he did it with text and drawings and collage and photography, hand lettering. It is just really beautifully done, and I find this book incredibly inspiring. Look at these maps. I mean, come on. That is just gorgeous. And I really hope to be able to do this kind of work, perhaps for the book that I'm working on, maybe for something else. I don't know. I just love, love, love this book. He did a beautiful job of giving us the sense of what's happening. So if we look at this illustration, zoom in just a little. In the foreground, we have the mother, the indigenous mother, with her baby in the water. And then look at the pollution, which is drawn as if it's a snake or some kind of evil creature that's coming from mining upstream. So he's really telling this story of how gold mining is affecting the native peoples in this area of South America, and telling that story in a very vivid way, but with such a beautifully drawn and very simple illustration. Look at the texture that he got in the water that looks like it's the texture of the paper. This is just wonderful. And the book is filled with so many illustrations like that. Photography. Oh, it's just really such a nice book. It's one of these that you can pick up over and over again. You can read it, or you can just look at the beautiful illustrations. Wonderfully done. Drawn, The Art of Ascent by Jeremy Collins. The next book I'd like to share with you is Jane the Fox and Me, written by Fanny Britt, my favorite illustrator, I believe, although Rebecca Green is also one of my favorites. But I love Isabel Arsenault's work, and this book in particular. As I mentioned a moment ago, I have a aspiration to do some kind of sequential art, and Isabel illustrated this book so beautifully, from a big establishing shot and then coming down into details and then getting even closer in details. Much of this was done in graphite. A lot of these drawings are very monotone. She has a beautiful way of using value contrast, of using stylization, but yet capturing actual gestures that are very lifelike. So it's a wonderful balance between what is fantastic and not realistic and what is very realistic. Look at that. This is just a wonderful illustration. This is the main character's mom sending the children to bed, telling them to shush and be quiet. It's a beautiful gestural drawing. It's very simple. It's very loose. I'm so emotional today. Just a wonderful, wonderful book, and so beautifully done. And the story is also very wonderful. I very much relate to the young girl who is our main character. I was a bullied, ostracized kid at the same age as she is in this story. And so I feel a great kinship to her. I also had a deep connection to nature as a young child. I am so teary today, y'all. I don't know what's wrong with me. And so this book really speaks to me. Look at how beautifully and emotional that illustration is. It captures her loneliness and her feeling of hurt. So beautiful. It's wonderfully done, and really a beautiful book to have in any illustrator's collection, but particularly if you aspire to some kind of sequential art. This is Jane the Fox and Me, illustrated by Isabel Arsenault. I want to acknowledge also some vintage illustrations, these by Roger Tory Peterson, who really pioneered a lot of bird illustration. He pioneered bird illustration for field guides, and he really was the first person to do field guide illustration in a way that is more related to the way that modern field guide illustration is done. But I really wanted to call attention to some of these lovely compilation drawings that he did of birds like these sandpipers. I have long found his work so clean, really very beautiful, and often very lifelike. He was a lifelong illustrator and lover of birds. I actually got the chance to meet him very briefly in South Texas. I think he was in his late 80s at the time. Actually had become quite a lot more interested in butterflies than birds by then. But he was very patient and lovely with us as we came over and introduced ourselves and got him to autograph our field guides, of course. But aren't these beautiful? So a really lovely sense of the way birds can be illustrated that show them in lifelike poses, doing things birds do. Really wonderful. This is How to Know the Birds. When was this published? Let's take a look. This book was published originally in 1949, and this copy 1957. Also another of Roger Tory Peterson's vintage books, A Field Guide to Western Birds. You sometimes will see me photograph these birds when I do flat lays for thumbnails, for example. And this is, more traditional style of illustration, but wow, you can really tell how vintage this is by the lovely, let's zoom in on that. By the lovely hand lettering. Oh, isn't it gorgeous? That is so pretty. And these are obviously very static illustrations of the sort that one would expect to see in a field guide, because it is a field guide. Many in black and white. We have to remember color printing, more modern. And this book was published in, there's some color. There's a color plate, but not many color plates in this book because it's old. It is 1941. Yeah, so kind of leaving the golden age of illustration here by 1941, but still these wonderful, wonderful hand-lettered figures. I just love that. So beautiful. I find these books really, truly inspiring. And then, last but not least, this is actually from my husband's collection. This was a bird book of his, and you can see how old and well-loved it is. American Birds in Color by Hal Harrison. This is not an illustrated work. This is a photography work published in 1948. But it's still one that I find very inspiring, if for no other reason than it gives me this sense of how books like these form a lasting contribution, and that even when they become out of date, or the style of the way they're presented has changed, they still make a contribution to our love and appreciation of all things feathered. So that's a few of the books from my collection that I find inspiring. You may remember that last year I did an illustration of a Trumpeter Swan. This is a banded bird, and shared the story of this bird, whose band designation is 4-2. She's a Trumpeter Swan, and she spent the spring with us last year here in Western Oregon. Story is very inspiring to me. Obviously, her story was very compelling to me because I did this little illustration of her. And because of the kind of life I lead, especially because of the man I'm married to, who is an ornithologist and who looks at birds every day, I hear lots and lots of stories of birds, and I find those stories to be very inspiring. Well, I have a little bit of a follow-up on this story, and I wanted to share it with you. So, 4 at 2 is back. She showed back up at the same area where she was last year. And last year, you may recall, she was alone. And at the time, I thought maybe she had lost her mate, although I have since learned that she was probably too young to have had a mate to start with. She is not alone anymore. She has a mate. He is also banded and has another one of these neck collars, the same as she does, and they have 2 babies with them. So these are young from last year. You can tell that by their gray plumage. So 4 at 2 has a mate and has kids now. Isn't that exciting? So Douglas, being Douglas, has connections and got included on some correspondence about 4 at 2, giving us more of her story. And I wanted to share some of that with you. So it turns out that this is the 4th time that this bird has been here visiting us in Western Oregon. She was reported in 2019 with her sister at Finley National Wildlife Refuge on May the 5th, 2019. Then both 4 at 2 and her sister were reported in British Columbia in May. Then they came back to Finley in June. So they were in Oregon, they went to British Columbia, they came back to Oregon, then they went to Summer Lake, Washington, not Summer Lake, Oregon. I didn't realize there was a Summer Lake, Washington. And they were seen regularly there through the winter. The sister bird to 4 at 2 was found dead there, and he doesn't say what her cause of death was, but she died in October 2019. So then she came back here in 2020. Then she went to Summer Lake again, so all the way to Washington, then came back to Finley. And then during that spring, she seemed to be dating a male swan, but she was 3 years old, and he said that she was probably not ready to breed. So that was the report in 2020. Then in 2022, of course, we know she was here in 2021. In 2022, here she's back. And so here's what the guy says then. He says that 8 at 8, this is her male, her mate, is a 4-year-old male hatched at Summer Lake in 2018. And the person who reported this to the guy who's now giving us some information about 8 at 8 saw 4 at 2 and 8 at 8 courting, so doing some little romantic swan things. So undoubtedly they will try to nest again, but seem to have already produced 2 young from last year, if indeed those kids are theirs. In case you're wondering, there's a couple of things I'd like to say about this. First, about banding birds. I, as a trained bird biologist, have banded birds myself. Hundreds and hundreds of birds. Little tiny metal bands that they wear on their legs. Obviously, the bands that swans wear are much larger, and those bands have numbers on them, and it's a unique number and a unique identifier. It does not bother the bird at all. It causes them no distress whatsoever. And these neck collars apparently do not bother these swans and other birds that wear neck collars. Does not bother them at all. The purpose of putting these markers on these birds is so that individual birds can be identified from a distance or by recapture, and that's called mark recapture. And then scientists can do all kinds of things with those data, from learning about how long birds live, what the rates of survival are, how many kids they produce, all kinds of things about their behavior. Practically everything we know about bird biology comes from marking birds. In the United States, we have the Bird Banding Lab. I believe it's in Patuxent, Maryland. And if you were to see a banded bird, like 4 at 2, and you were to get that information off of that neck collar, you could get online and submit that information to the Bird Banding Lab, and they would submit back to you a certificate telling you where that bird was banded, so that you will learn, something about that animal. In this case, because Douglas has a connection with the scientists who are actually doing this work, we get to give them a little bit of extra information about where the birds are moving around, who they're seen with, behaviors, and things like that. All of this contributes to our understanding of things like climate change and how that affects bird populations, and how things that we do to the environment, whether it be the way we change habitats through human activities or pollution, pesticides, all of those things that humans do, we can learn how those affect bird populations through marked studies like these. And of course, then we also get to share these stories. And as an illustrator, then I get to be inspired by these stories and move that forward into my art. So I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about the story of Foret to her continuing story. These birds actually live quite a long time, so we may get to see her again in future years. And also just how we learn these things about birds. So what did you think about all the art books? I am sure that you have lots of inspiring art books in your collection, and I'd love to hear what those are. So please do put some of those titles in the comments below so that I can check those out as well. There is a bookstore in McMinnville, which is a little bit north of Corvallis, Oregon, where I live, and I am itching to go back up there. They have an amazing collection of children's books, and there are a couple of illustrators whose names I cannot remember. And I really want to go back and get a couple of those books that I didn't buy the last time I was up there and wished I had. So, bookstores are so dangerous. And we don't get to visit bookstores the way we used to. It used to be, especially pre-COVID, that you could just go out to a bookstore. There are not that many bookstores around anymore. I know that I order a lot of my books from Amazon. Although we here in Western Oregon are blessed with some really fine bookstores. We've got two really nice bookstores here in Corvallis, Book Bin, which is mostly used books, and Grassroots Bookstore. And then the one in McMinnville, the name of which I can't recall. And then there is, of course, the amazing Powell's Books up in Portland. And certainly going to Powell's Books, which takes up an entire city block, is just a phenomenal experience. I actually visited there briefly in one of my vlogs a few months ago, and I'll leave you with a link to that one as well. If you have other sources of inspiration, I'd love to learn about those. A friend of mine and I were talking about inspiration and its role in being an artist. And she pointed out a distinction that I think was really fascinating and really set my wheels turning. She talked about the transition between inspiration and habit as an artist, that maybe early in our journeys as artists, when we're just starting out, that inspiration is much more important in terms of getting us going, and that at some point when art becomes a more serious pursuit, if you will, then we move over to habit. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that. I would also say that as an artist who exercises a lot of self-discipline to make art, because art's my job, and so I have a contract to fulfill, but I also exercise a lot of self-discipline in terms of just making art outside of the work I do that I get paid for. Inspiration still really serves a very important role for me in terms of helping me to stay motivated, helping me to keep my art practice fresh, especially my personal practice. And in fact, I talked a lot more about my personal practice in a recent video, and if you'd like to check that one out, I invite you to do so. Thank you so much for stopping by today, and I hope to see you again sometime soon. Take care. Bye now.